The Portland Art Museum is situated in the heart of downtown Portland in a place we now call Oregon, a place which lies in the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Oregon City Tumwater, Watlala, Clackamas Chinooks, and the Tualatin Kalapuya peoples, who were relocated to the Grand Ronde Reservation under the treaty with the Kalapuya of 1855, also known as the Willamette Valley Treaty. On behalf of the Portland Art Museum, I wish to recognize and honor the indigenous peoples of this place, on whose ancestral, of this region, on whose ancestral lands this museum now stands, and on whose lands we gather here this evening. We pay respect to their elders past and present. I ask you to please take a moment now and after tonight's program to reflect on the legacies of violence, displacement, migration, settlement, and resilience that bring us to where we are today. And I think that's something that has meant a lot to me as an individual and a lot to this institution as we reflect on the legacies of our own museum here in Portland, but a lot of institutions and roles of government and non-government here within our lives. So that has been an important part of us and the reflections we've been doing as an institution and individuals. I'm so honored to be introducing our speaker here this evening, Tanya Autry. As a cultural organizer in the visual arts, Tanya centers social justice and public memory in her work. In addition to co-creating The Art of Black Descent, an interactive program that promotes public dialogue about African American liberation, she has also brought together Social Justice and Museums Resource List, an online crowdsourced bibliography that keeps growing and growing. Tanya has curated exhibitions and organized programs at Yale University Art Gallery, Art Space in New Haven, Mississippi Museum of Art, Tougaloo College, and the Crane Art Center, and now serves as the Gund Curatorial Fellow at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland. Through her graduate studies at University of Delaware, where she's completing her Ph.D. in art history, she's developed expertise in the art of the United States, in photography, and museums. Her dissertation, entitled The Crossroads of Commemoration, Lynching Landscapes in America, concentrates on the interplay of race, representation, memory, and public space. And I feel so fortunate to have known Tanya these last few years through work that we've both done within the field of museums. And I have so much respect for Tanya as a real leading thinker in sort of where museums are headed or hopefully headed, and the transformations happening these days. We initially met through our participation in museums as sites of social action, which was centered at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And now through our work in the Museums Are Not Neutral movement, which has included selling a few thousand of these t-shirts and really this huge social media kind of campaign. And even though this idea isn't something that we generated, it's been a long time discussed. It is an extremely important conversation to be having about the myth of neutrality in institutions like museums. The Museums Are Not Neutral initiative has sold t-shirts all around the world, and we've been able to raise over $15,000 for social justice organizations and charities, including Southern Poverty Law Center and the Community Fund of Greater Flint, which is working with children's health concerns in Flint, Michigan right now. So that's the current social justice charity. Tonight's lecture is part of the museum's programming for the exhibition Colorline, Black Excellence on the World Stage, curated by Alex Haynes and featuring the photographs and data visualizations from W.E.B. Du Bois' exhibition at the 1900 Paris Exposition. And I wanted to take this opportunity to thank Alex, along with, yay! And along with Ted Smith, Ella Ray, Grace Cook Anderson, John Goodwin, and many others who came together to make this exhibition possible. So I want to applaud them too. Tonight's lecture is also part of a powerful series of events and programs led by Don't Shoot Portland in honor of the memory of Mike Brown, killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri 5 years ago tomorrow. I encourage you to attend a series of panel discussions and workshops happening tomorrow at the Dismantle, Change, Build Center on Northeast Killingsworth, and help support Don't Shoot Portland's Back to School supply drive, as well as a whole community arts programming on Saturday. Enormous thanks to Teresa Rayford and the entire team with Don't Shoot Portland. So with all that said, thank you all so much for being here, and please join me in welcoming our guest, Tanya Autry.
Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here, and so great to see such a wonderful turnout. I'm going to grab some water. I have been losing my voice from allergies or something, so please forgive me if I have to stop every now and then. So thank you for such a warm welcome. And it's really an honor to speak with you this evening. And I appreciate everybody here at Portland Art Museum that's supported bringing me out. I haven't never been to the West, well, I've been to the West Coast. I've been to California several times, but I've never been to Oregon. So I'm really happy to be here. And of the many kind people, I want to especially acknowledge Mike Morowski for the invitation to speak here on the occasion of this really important exhibition, Color Line, Black Excellence on the World Stage. And as Mike said, we've been getting to know each other over the last few years, mainly through digital spaces. So actually I've not talked with Mike in person, hardly ever. Mostly through Twitter, sometimes through email, and a couple phone calls, but really in Skype kind of things like that. So it's wonderful to spend time with him on his home turf as we celebrate the second anniversary of our Museums Are Not Neutral initiative, and we're still going strong. And as we've been talking about the times, I actually want to recognize our time, like right now. So this has been a very difficult week. We've experienced a lot of violence again. I haven't looked at the news really today, so I don't know what happened today, but I wouldn't be surprised. So many of us have experienced very kind of heavy feelings in the past days, and of these moments, I want to start, let me see, let's get this going here. Oops. I want to start with a reflection about Toni Morrison. So on Tuesday, I was at work. I work at an art museum, and I learned of her passing. I was already at work, and a pain definitely grew inside of me, and I almost started crying at my desk. And Toni Morrison, she just is. It's not for particular people, but Toni Morrison is a towering figure in literature and Black studies and feminism and life in general. And many people argue that she was the best American author ever. And so when I was sitting at my desk, I looked around for signs of shock with other people and if they knew what was happening, because it had happened the night before. I was just learning about it that morning. And I ended up, I guess that I was the only one who was shocked just looking around because it seemed like it was a normal day. So I ended up sharing the news with the people around me, and a couple of them stopped and they acknowledged the moment for a few seconds. And this experience, it reminds me of when I learned of Maya Angelou's passing back in 2014. I was at a workshop of a social justice conference that was happening in Chicago. And someone interrupted our session to come in and tell us, to announce that Maya Angelou had passed away. And at that time, many people were shaken. It was a lot of people. Some people openly cried. And I felt that we had lost family, and together we reflected on the many moments where Angelou had shaped our lives. And at that time, I felt that I was with people who cared about us and people that do care about me. And I mention this as a contrast from what I experienced this week at work with folks. Morrison's contributions have shaped my thinking, my curatorial praxis, and my activism deeply. And one of the chief lessons that she has imparted on me is she's made me stronger and more apologetic about my conviction to center Black people in everything I do. She unabashedly created stories about Black life for Black people. Other people could read the work, of course, and grow and learn a lot from it, but she didn't make them the intended readers. She was really producing work for Black people. So as a Black woman who's trained in art history, this is a discipline that has and does has a long history of excluding Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, cultural producers through various modes in terms of canon formation, just many, many things. I've had to figure out how to exist, going through the training, and often you just want to give up because it's a field that really keeps people, that puts you on the margins and wants you to feel that. And so I've had to learn how to figure out how to shape my own path. And because of Morrison's fierce brilliance, I routinely ask myself when I'm producing, if I'm writing something, I'm planning shows and programs, I ask myself, who is this for? And I also ask, how can I make this project care for Black folks? So this orientation, it aligns with the praxis of many other leading Black women thinkers, such as Audre Lorde, Saidiya Hartman, and Christina Sharp in particular. And it's really about an issue of representation, but it also operates beyond the simple portrayal of a wider spectrum of society. It's kind of about a deeper liberatory-centered work, or rather a racial justice-centered work. It entails connection, commitment, understanding, and love. And I'm mentioning all of this because I want to think about representation and racial justice activism work in terms of visual culture. I want to think about their relationship. So representation is, extremely important, but it doesn't necessarily mean structural change. So Morrison, as I said, is highly influential for me and for many, many people. And while she was, of course, a renowned literary artist, her expertise and love of language made her a profound creator of images. And this, if you've read Beloved, you might recall this passage. I just want to read here. What I remember is a picture floating around out there, outside my head. I mean, even if I don't think it, even if I die, the picture of what I did, or know, or saw, is still out there. It's right in the place where it happened. So in that passage, she's talking, it was Setha, the character Setha is talking to her daughter, Denver, about living on this forced labor camp, which we might call plantation. And it's called Sweet Home. Toni Morrison, I remember reading about how she, her writing process is very interesting to read about how she got ideas for writing. And she said that for her, the writing starts with images, like an actual picture she gets in her mind. And she said the image comes first and tells me what the memory is about. And she wrote this in an article called The Site of Memory. I think you can get it if you just Google that. It comes up as a PDF. Her practice of working with pictures where she's collecting them, they're coming to her mind. She's collecting them, she's pursuing them, she's arranging them. And it's really exciting to think about in tandem with W.E.B. Du Bois's photographs for the American Negro Exhibit of the 1900 Paris Exposition. I hadn't really seen that connection, and it was really through her passing this week that I started to go, wait a minute, there's something here. So I actually changed this paper significantly just in the last day or so. So it's going to be interesting with what's going to unfold here. So W.E.B. Du Bois's project, what we have on the screen right now is just, here's one of the 363 photographs that were included in that exhibition in 1900. That show was on view in Paris. And so when I say Du Bois's photographs, I don't mean that I don't want to suggest that he made these images, like with a camera. So as far as we know, there's really no evidence that he ever took pictures. He probably took some, but that he was out there making photographs. We know that many of the photographs in the series were produced by Thomas E. Askew, an African-American photographer, and some works aren't attributed. And as I'll be talking about these pictures in relationship to kind of a long history of racial justice, liberatory kind of process, visual culture, I want to think about, I'll continue talking about who's producing images. We'll think about who the audiences are. We'll think about the negotiation of gazes. So Du Bois, his part in this is that he is involved in curation. He's basically selecting the photographs that will be used. He's gathering them. He's making an extensive visual record. Oh, and the book that I wanted to say that I'm getting some of the ideas from is Sean Michelle Smith's book. It's called Photography on the Color Line, and some of you might have read it. If you haven't, check it out. It's an excellent book. She talks about Du Bois really as a visual theorist. I think that's the term she uses. And I don't hear many people say that, but he really is. A lot of people talk about this idea of double consciousness. You probably heard of that, right? Of African Americans living with a sense of double consciousness, of the sense of seeing oneself as others would see you. And he is thinking about race not just as representation. This is how Smith talks about it in her book. She's like, it's not race just as representation. It's race in terms of the gaze, in terms of the actual looking, racialized looking. The process of looking is a race project in itself. So for tonight, I want to spend some time thinking about Du Bois's project of building and displaying really what is an archive of Black life in relation with other visual strategies that people have employed for liberatory aims. And so, as I mentioned, I wrote the description for this talk months ago. I don't even remember when it was exactly, but it was probably like 5 months ago or 4 months ago. And then I started writing it more recently. And I realized that when I looked at it a few weeks ago, I was like, that's kind of crazy, all the stuff I said I was going to talk about. It's like from 1900 to 2019, practically. And it's really cool stuff, and I think it's really more appropriate for a semester-long course. Yeah. I tend to do this, where I have like all these things, and I get overly ambitious. I just do it over and over again. I generally think that's cool, but it's also really frustrating for me and for other people, probably. So tonight what I'm going to be doing is a snapshot approach. I'm going to take you on this journey with me, and I'll let you know that my thinking process tends to be very integrative, so I see a lot of connections of a lot of things, just like starting with Toni Morrison. Some of you probably I thought we were here to hear about Du Bois. We're going to hear about a whole lot of things. My process tends to be kind of holistic. I get involved in like journeys, and I like to be discussion-centered. So I'm going to be trying to shift the lenses regularly this evening, and just buckle up for this. So yeah, the American Negro Exhibit in 1900, as we know, Du Bois has said the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, and unfortunately, I think we still have that same problem today. You know, Du Bois was born in 1868, died in 1968, and I'm highlighting that because Morrison, as I said, she was born in 1931, and as we know, recently passed. It's a big difference, right, in her approach to things, and very different for what Du Bois was about. He graduated from Harvard in 1895, and as the show talks about, basically this is the first generation of folks after slavery, so-called, ended. And I'm saying so-called because actually the way the law is written, slavery can continue if you are convicted of a crime. And so we actually still live with this. And of course, with Jim Crow and everything, we're actually really not out of slavery. But so Du Bois is this really fascinating person because he was a civil rights activist, he was a Pan-Africanist, he's training in sociology, he was an educator, a historian, a writer, an editor, a poet, and of course, as Sean Michelle Smith has said, he's also a visual theorist of race. And he's making what she calls as a counter-archive. So the series of photographs. And it's really important to think about what was happening in the U.S. at this time. So he graduated Harvard in 1895. 1900 is this show in Paris. And he's putting on these photographs, and I'll just kind of show a few more. So that's a photo of him looking very sharp, very dandy-like. And the other one, you can see a little bit of what the space looked like and how things were exhibited. And it's 1900, it's a really different exhibition kind of style. So there was a series, the photographs are in a series called, make sure I get the name right exactly. It's basically types of the American Negro. And he's existing in this time where there's this idea of science, of people taking photographs of people, particularly of African Americans and other folks. The eugenics movement is considered actual science, and photography becomes really a part of creating ideas about race and suggesting that some people are of different species. And it actually starts really early in the 19th century, in the 1800s. There was a scientist from Harvard, Louis Agassiz, some of you might have heard of. He hired a photographer, his last name is Zealy, this was down in South Carolina, to make daguerreotype images of enslaved people. And they had no actual power to say they don't want to be photographed or not. They were enslaved people. And they were made to strip, and like the women had to expose their breasts, and there were shots taken of them standing and sitting. Some were frontal shots, some were profile shots. And I don't have any of those in here, but if you've seen them, you can't really forget them. His expressions on these people's faces, they're very sad and horrific kind of images. And Agassiz, the so-called scientist, was using those pictures as his theory of polygenesis, his idea that some people were from a different species. So this stuff is starting early. Photography is heavily like part of that project of creating these ideas about some people aren't human, or they're different. They're a different species. We're not all just humankind. And so that's still going on. There's a lot of other theorists out there, Francis Galton, eugenicists, and mentioning how the people's photographs are taken, because that is a certain style of photography of taking that continues through the 1900s, of that kind of shot, the frontal shot and the profile shot. And what's interesting is that Du Bois is, he's existing in this time, and he's actually trying to work against a lot of those ideas, but he basically, in his project, employs some of those strategies. And so let's look at a few more shots. These, and some of the images, so some, I don't even know if I put them in here. Let me see, go for it. I think I didn't put the real straightforward ones like that, those frontal and profile shots. They're interesting because the lens tends to be closer to the subject, and of course you'll see them right outside the door, actual reproductions of them. The lens tends to be closer to the subject and almost like mugshot-like. We still do this type of photography. And he is making a point, like the pictures are all of people who are from Atlanta, and they're mainly people that are really middle-class folks. These are people who are in professional life. And he's really trying to work against the stereotype of African Americans, is that they are, they're not actually human, all of this kind of horrible, crazy racist stuff. And that they are not able to achieve things, they're not that intelligent. So he's basically creating a record to speak against that, but it's interesting because he employs some of those same visual strategies that the racial scientists are using. And I think he's using it trying to show a counterpoint as a proof against, but it's a really interesting thing. So some of the photographs, like the ones that we just kind of are going through, are a little different too, though. So there's those more, quote, scientific-looking mugshot ones, and then there's these other ones where the lens pulls away from the subject, and you get a little bit of a sense of an environment. And you can see them, like people interacting with some activity, things like that. And again, they are also kind of very staged, and they also have like a sentimentalist kind of quality to them as well. He's making a point where he's really wanting to emphasize the humanity of the subjects, and this is like a long-standing goal, trope maybe, to say, with people that are trying to fight racism and using the camera is one of those ways. There's a long discussion about trying to show the humanity of subjects, so really making the camera be this kind of point to expose the humanity. And it's an interesting topic and also kind of problematic or interesting goal. Because in some ways, I feel like it's still something we're trying to do, is we're trying to teach people about the humanity of others instead of just assuming, hey, they're people. You know, we don't start with that. We keep trying to prove our humanity. And so I really want to stress that it's really a problematic thing in itself. And I understand why he was doing it. And again, to keep in mind the time he's living in 1900, you know, that's a time when there's a lot of lynching that's happening also in the United States. Lynching, it was basically the heyday of lynching, really from the late 1880s through about 1930. Thousands of people are just being murdered, and there's no accountability. And so there's a lot of different things that activists, black activists, and others are trying to do to stymie that violence. And one of them was to go with this mode of trying to show our humanity to white folks. So you have to think about the exhibition, too. In Paris, who's attending this exhibition? This is not an exhibition that is for African Americans or African people. This is an exhibition for white folks. And so he's working to try to show white people that black people have humanity, that we are able to achieve great things, and we have. And also at the time when this is on view, in the same area, they have displays. They have these little villages that are set up, these horrific little spaces that are supposed to show people from around the world what so-called like Africans, how they live and things like that, and other people that are non-white. Very racist kind of program. So his project is a counter archive, the photos and having these on view, and even just thinking of how he's dressed while he's at this place, and the kind of racism he's experiencing regularly, and that he came up with that theory of double consciousness, of seeing oneself always through the eyes of someone else. That's a lot of heavy stuff, but at the same time, it's important to think about, like, sometimes by engaging some of the same strategies that have been used to put down cultural groups, it can be really problematic. Like, it seems like sometimes he's reifying these class divisions, because the photographs tend to be focusing mainly on middle-class people. So when you're talking about types of American Negroes and stuff like that, we don't see other people. We don't see them as humanity. It's showing a certain class of folks, so professional people who've been to college and things like that. And then it's also engaging with certain colorism, certain kind of weird gender coding, how the women are shown in the photographs. And I really just want to highlight these things, because often I think we end up kind of not thinking deeply and critically about these things, because we want to give him credit for the important work that he is doing, but we also want to see how these things are implicated, right? And they also have problems in them as well. So he is trying to work against this kind of scientific racism, but he is using, at the same time, playing with some of those tropes of it. And here you can see people in environments, so like working in a laboratory. And again, that same kind of thing in the fellowship of these individuals, and all extremely important perspectives, but we don't see, other people who are sharecroppers, also who are dignified human beings, but they're not presented in this portfolio of all these 363 photographs. I think there's some agricultural workers, but they're not the majority of the people in here. And some of us know that Du Bois had this whole theory, this idea of the talented 10th, that there would be a group of African Americans that would go on to school and may become the professional class, and that they would raise up the other black people. And that talented 10th, they were going to uplift the race. There is a lot of heavily problematic elitism in that kind of thinking. Something else, so that's 1900. I'm jumping ahead a little bit again. I'm going to just keep doing this, so just be ready. 1916, so Du Bois was the editor. He was one of the people that helped found the Crisis magazine. So that shows 1900, 1916, but the crisis started earlier than that. The 1960 I'm highlighting just because of this one particular horrific lynching that happened in Waco, Texas. And the Crisis magazine Du Bois was one of many people. It's probably like 10 people that were really involved with starting it. It's basically the official publication for the NAACP. And it's a publication that is highlighting Black life, and it's really got an activist orientation. Photography is dominant in the publication. It's also going out to other people too. It's not just to African Americans. This particular issue, they named it the Waco Horror. And it's high, you can see, I don't have it showing here. Let me show you here. So over on the left is the first page of this particular supplement that came out in July, I believe, of the crisis. So they have their regular journal, and then they came out with this one because of this really horrific killing that happened of Jesse Washington, who was basically a teenager with mental disability who was accused of murdering a white woman in Waco, Texas. He was found guilty. It's, with these things, it's really hard to even talk about is anybody being found guilty or so forth, because often there's no actual court case, and if there is, it's a complete farce. So anyway, he was found guilty of killing this woman, Lucy Fryer, and a mob ended up storming the courthouse. And I'm trying to see if one of these pictures was the courthouse or one of these little illustrations. Anyway, the mob ended up storming the courthouse and taking him right from the trial room, dragging him out with a rope and everything down the stairs. They killed him. It was a long process. Often these things involve not the word ceremony, but sometimes. In his case, it was basically throughout the city and across the bridge, and just dragged this poor person all over the place. Ended up killing him in front of City Hall. And everybody knew this was going to happen because they advertised it in the newspaper ahead of time. So, that's why I'm just like, the idea that he was found guilty is like a joke. They advertised it, and hundreds of people came. The numbers are uncertain of how many people were there, like 1,000 or something. They had excursion train that showed up. And they killed this kid right in front of City Hall. It was really, really horrible. And these things, this is just one of many, many killings. So what's interesting here is that the NAACP sent a reporter down there who was there, didn't come there and say, I'm a reporter, was just kind of there incognito, and ended up collecting photographs. Photographs were made of the event, and that was kind of typical. And they made postcards of the murder, and that reporter brought those photographs and brought them back and gave them to Du Bois, who ended up publishing them in this particular supplement of the Waco Horror. And what's interesting about this is how it's laid out, and I didn't include any of the pages that have photographs of the person, of Jesse Washington's body, and I did that on purpose. Try to be careful about showing these kind of things. Du Bois, I think it's interesting in how the pictures were laid out where he's showing the city and the city infrastructure, and he wants to show that Waco is this, it's a place it's not, people think it's all out west, and that lynching happened when it was just cowboy days, and this is a city. It's got architecture, they have a court system, they have all of these things. So interestingly, he starts the essay, and he was part of putting like the editorial decisions here, like how things are laid out, it's a huge story about what's in the city to show that there is culture, there is, it's a modern place. So he starts with that, and then the pages following page 3 are just the layout of talking about the murder that happened. And at the very end, on the last page, and you can't really read this probably. Oh, you can read it maybe. He talks about lynching, and he's really breaking it out here. And they're talking about how many per year. And throughout the text, there is a point where this is about the murder of Jesse Washington, the lynching of him by these thousands of people, but there's a point where he's like, this isn't even really about Jesse Washington. He makes a point where he says that. He's like, it's actually about just this practice, this thing of lynching. And I think in this text he says, don't look at Jesse. Don't look at Jesse Washington. Think about what this is doing to the soul of America. And again, this is thinking about who is your intended audience. I think this is like a really important kind of moment, again, to think about the audience. So when he was doing the exhibit that was in Paris, that was pretty much for a white audience, and Europeans and some Americans who would be there, and in doing important work, trying to change how people think and get them to recognize that Black people are people. But it does something kind of strange in a way, because this supplement, it ended up being that they put out a special, I don't remember how many thousand, they produced more than the normal amount, and they sent them to Congress, to every member of Congress and the president. It was really a political gesture that was made. And again, it's about trying to change the nation, trying to change people, and mainly white folks. What's interesting to me about this is that it has this really strong political aspect, but it actually doesn't offer a lot of care for Jesse Washington and his family, this kind of mode in a way. And like I said, I didn't include the photographs of Washington, his body, and all that. I didn't include them, but they're included in the supplement. So again, thinking about who is the intended viewer, and again about proving humanity of, like us making efforts to prove our humanity. He's trying different things. And this is, again, another strategy that I think we still have of like appealing to certain people, and we sometimes strip away, we don't pay attention to the individuals and that kind of harm that already exists and continues, and sometimes is reified in the things that we produce that we are using for political means to create important change. Okay, I'm jumping way ahead. Now we're in 1956, and this is by Gordon Parks. And Gordon Parks, is one of these important seminal Black photographers, photographer, and then as a Black photographer, he was able to enter some spaces that maybe others would not be able to enter, and also, of course, was treated a certain way because he's Black. So in 1956, Life magazine ended up doing this series where they were looking at segregation in the U.S. And Gordon Parks did the photographs for one of the months. And this is an interesting series. So he did he was doing the one for the September 24th. He did the pictures for that. So this is a little bit, these pictures he didn't do, this one. The Voices of the White South. So the series is all about segregation and thinking about the U.S., but I wouldn't say, like when you really read the text and stuff and you see how Life put it, they did one of those kind of both sides kind of things, So it's like, let's show how segregation is, see how it affects white people and how it affects Black people. And it's not that they're really doing racial justice work in Life magazine. It's an important moment if you're interested in this kind of thing, you're studying it. But again, it's about being careful about how we think about representation, what it means for them to do this. So in this particular one, in the Voices of the White South, the November 17th issue, is very sympathetic to segregationists. And the people that they interview basically, say why the segregation is necessary, and their ideas. And the person who's the author doesn't really question it. They don't push back. They don't ask them questions about how they're getting these ideas. And then the journal just kind of publishes it. And again, I think this is something we see now. If we think about our news media, which doesn't seem to be doing its job really. It's like not questioning things. It's just going, hey, well, we're doing a story. We do both sides or something really bizarre. We keep using this both sides terminology. Gordon Parks, he is at the time the only black photographer at Life magazine, and he ended up, he's a really smart guy. He was taking pictures earlier in the 40s, and some of you know he did photography with the Farm Security Administration, working with Roy Stryker, and when he went to D.C., he hadn't, I don't know, I think there's some kind of story about when he met Roy Stryker, who was heading up that program. He was told to go to these different places, like a bunch of different spots in D.C., and just check it out. And then he tried to go to these places, and he found that they wouldn't allow black people to go in them. And he was very frustrated, and he came back, and supposedly this story is that Stryker wanted him to deal with that frustration and be documenting that. And so anyway, Gordon Parks didn't have a lot of experience in photography originally, and ended up becoming this really important photographer. So he met with his family and ended up documenting their life and what they had to live with, and showing kind of the inside of their homes. And the woman, I think the woman who's standing here with the blue top on, she's a teacher. And the family talked candidly with him about their life and what it's like to live in this area, experiencing hardcore segregation. And they ended up, I think both people ended up losing their jobs. The woman who was a school teacher, and the husband, he worked as, he did something like cutting down trees and things like that. And both of them lost their jobs, and I think they also lost their home for being candid and talking with reporters. Parks wasn't writing a story here. He was doing the photography, but he did talk with subjects. And he ended up working out a deal with Life, and I'm not sure if it was at this point or if it was a little later, where he required that he have control over the captions. And that's actually a really big deal, to be able to control how the captions are going to be worded. And I think that came a little later, actually. Some more photographs from this series. And really, again, thinking about who the audience is. For Life magazine, this is what we would call as a mainstream publication. So there are definitely going to be black people who are going to be buying this magazine and looking at it, but it's mostly a lot of white audience. And I think that's part of why the journal or the publication it's not making a stand against racism necessarily. And this is a more liberal publication at the time. This is actually considered quite liberal, but it's problematic. Anyway, photographs are definitely, for that time, really important for showing, again, humanity of black subjects. But in a very different kind of way, I think, than what we're seeing with the Du Bois. Again, more like the everyday life and showing people who are not necessarily, middle-class people and stuff like that. Obviously, the family that I told you about, the man who cuts down trees and things, those very working-class people. And I want to put that in dialogue with, this is a march that happened in 1957. And have some of you heard of the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom? Some people have heard of it. Yay! I'm really glad. Because I didn't know about the Prayer Pilgrimage myself. And I study civil rights issues, and I started moving into studying civil rights photography. And I hadn't heard of the Prayer Pilgrimage years ago. I learned about it a few years. That's the next one. I learned about it a few years ago when I worked on this exhibition that was on view at Yale 2 years ago, and it's been traveling. Right now it's on view in Jackson, Mississippi. So the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom happened in 1957. It was on the 3rd anniversary of the Brown decision, which, again, one of those important legislative moments, and many of us celebrated as ending segregation in our school system, and yet at the same time, we know that we have not ended segregation in our school system or anything in the United States. We are still very much a segregated society. So it made some big, important changes, but in many ways, if you start to really look at the record, you'll see that our schools are more segregated today than they were in the 1950s. And New York City is one of the most segregated of all of the U.S. So, again, thinking about how these things that we celebrate, and some people just want to stop there, but in reality, these are these ongoing kind of things that we have to work on. So in 57, there was this event that happened called the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom, where people, basically it's like a March on Washington. We just don't call it that, but that's what it is. It's a gathering on the Mall in Washington, D.C., where thousands of people came from across the U.S., mainly African American, and through the photography that was done, Lee Freelander was just one of many photographers that was there. He was a young man, I think about 20, 22 when he took these pictures. There were a lot of other folks there. Cartier-Bresson was there. I can't remember this other person. Some major photographers. And yet this is an event that so many people do not know, and it's not celebrated. And this is also the first time that Dr. King, if you see he's in the corner over here, is a very young man. This is his first national address. So it was a very important event. It was on radio. It wasn't television, but it was on radio, and it was played over and over again. And there had been, of course, other mass assemblies that happened in D.C., but this is the first time for African Americans to basically inhabit that space. And they did it actually really using it and calling it it's a prayer pilgrimage. It was a religious gathering. It was people on the National Mall. There were prayers. It was a religious event, but it's also a form of a protest. They're protesting segregation, and in the schools, Dr. King, in his speech is called "Give Us the Ballot." And it's a speech, but it's also a prayer. So it's excellent. I hope you have a chance to read it at some point. But he basically highlights 3 big points. He talks about the segregation existing still in the schools. He talks about voter suppression, and he talks about racial violence. And so when I read that speech, I thought, wow, okay, that's 1957, and guess what? We have all of those problems right now. It's just, yeah. It's really outrageous. Like 60 years later, still dealing with the same thing. And so anyway, the pictures are interesting. Freelander is not known for doing civil rights photography. He really didn't do anything else like this. So this is this one moment where he took these pictures. Many people see it as a complete anomaly to his practice, but it's really not. If you know his work, he actually has done a lot of portraiture and things like that, taking pictures of people in outdoor spaces and stuff like that. So I would say they're not totally strange. It's just that he didn't do civil rights events. But when I talked to him, he said that actually he thinks a lot of his work was helping the movement, or it was about these kind of themes, and he's always been interested in it. So he doesn't see it as so distinctly different. And also formally, there's a lot of connections as well. But what I want to focus on here is, I showed you a little bit of people on the ground. Freelander, when I talked to him, when I interviewed him, when I was writing an essay for the show, he used this expression, on the ground, like doing on-the-ground photography. And he was saying, so he had permission to go up on the stage, the platform that was right at the Lincoln Memorial. He had permission to be up there. He started up there, but then he got on the ground, and he said that's where he felt like most of the energy was really happening. That's where things were happening. And it made me think of, he didn't say this, but it made me think of Bell Hooks. So she has this theory about margins, about centers and margins. And to me, again, because I'm one of these people who sees all these connections and stuff, and I start following that path, and I started thinking about her theory. She says that, while, how we use this expression, marginalized communities, people who are marginalized, we often kind of just stop there, and we don't think about, well, okay, so yeah, people are pushed in these margins, but they create their own world. Their own world exists in those margins. That margin can be a center. And so Bell Hooks talks about that. I think it's the articles like, I don't remember the exact title, Centers and Margins, or From Centers and Margins. I can find it for you. Anyway, I saw a connection with that, with this kind of discussion he had about being on the ground, and that's where energy was. And thinking about the people who were there for this event, I didn't include a bunch of pictures in here. The series has got about I think 53 images in it, or maybe 51. And then there were other pictures that other people took that day. And when you look at it, this is in May in Washington, D.C. Some of you might know what the weather is like in May in D.C. It is a hot, nasty place. And it's gross. And people in the photographs have like fur coats on and stuff, like fur stoles on. They're really dressed to the nines. And partly, it's the 50s, and that's how people were more formally dressed and attired. They were not wearing T-shirts and stuff like this so much. But this is basically church that's happening on the National Mall, and it is a gigantic big deal for these people to show up and to occupy that space. They know what they're doing is a political moment, is a political gesture for them to be there, and they are basically trying to look their best. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, I was paying attention to how people were dressed, thinking about what it meant for them, how they were representing themselves, thinking about the exchange of the gaze, thinking about how they were responding to this white photographer, this young white man walking around with a small camera. He was getting up in people's face with a camera and taking their pictures. And I asked him about this, and he just kind of was like, yeah, it's fine. And I asked him, how do people respond to you? Because you're a white dude walking around with a camera in the 50s, and they're out there talking about racial violence and stuff. And this is mainly black people here on the National Mall. And he didn't say much. I mean, he's an older gentleman now at this point, but also he doesn't like to do interviews, and I felt like he didn't want to engage with that question really, so it didn't go anywhere. But looking at the images, I was like, something is going on by how people respond to him. I only have a few pictures that I'm showing you here because we have a whole lot of other stuff to talk about, but people give him this look, like they're really like, I don't know what this is about, and they distrust him, and it's a lot going on in these images. I'll show you a couple more. Oh, it's just a one where you can kind of see his angles. He messes around with angles and stuff. We could talk about that formally, but that's a different discussion. This is him. I actually really love this shot. This is like really one of my favorites because this is one of the few that in the series, I'm not even sure really how many pictures he took that day. He wouldn't let me know. Just the series has 50, 53 or something. But I don't know how many rolls of film he was. But this is the only one in there where he's embedded. He's in this group of people. And I'm going to come back to that and talk about what that means. But this one I have to show you. This little kid, he is like my favorite. He's like my favorite kid in this kind of no-nonsense, not putting up with your stuff kind of look, And I asked him about this moment. He doesn't remember, what was happening. He's, again, like I said, he's like 80s and stuff now. But this kid for me just meant everything. And thinking about the movement, thinking about 5 years, in 55, so just 2 years before, or less than 2 years actually, Emmett Till had been killed. So we know Emmett Till had been killed in Mississippi, and photos of his body, excuse me, ended up being published. His mother, Mamie Till Bradley, allowed photographs to be taken and published. She wanted, as she said, the world to see what they had done to her son. And again, photography being used as this kind of tool to try to create some change. It's a really difficult kind of thing when you think about that kind of image. Again, think about the lynching photographs and how Du Bois is using them, and thinking about, unfortunately, this woman how she felt she needed to do that for her son to generate some change. Those photographs were extremely important for young people, for a lot of people, but especially young people. What I've read, I read this account where Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, some of you know, basketball player, a really important basketball player. I read this account where he said how he grew up seeing those pictures. I think he was like maybe about the same age as Till, actually, when he was murdered. And his parents had told him about, racism and lynching. He grew up hearing these things, but a lot of it for him was, how kids are. It's like, yeah. I understand, and they think they understand. But he didn't really understand. And so he saw the pictures, and to think about what someone could do, and they could destroy your body. They could take your body, as Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about in his book, Between the World and Me. that expression, they could take your body. So I don't know if this kid, I don't know anything about this little boy, this Cub Scout here, but this picture resonated for me a great deal. In some ways, I just loved it because I just thought, visually it's a really interesting picture, how it's organized, blah, 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 right? As an art historian. But also I just love how this kid has got his arms folded, and he's staring this photographer down. It's just like, I'm not going to be taking any crap from you. And he's just got so much gumption. He's just this little boy. And then I also thought about how he's kind of the next wave that happens. So these people they're doing that respectability thing. They're trying to be very respectable. They bring out all their best outfits and stuff, and they're all paying attention. They're looking the way they should be looking, and he's not facing that way. And so for me, I might be extrapolating too much, but I think there's something in here when you think about what's going to happen in the 60s. You think about the Black Panther, the Black Power movement that comes out, to think about this younger generation that is not going to fall in line with the same thing. Dr. King, in his speech, there's something he says in his speech. When I was doing the show, I was like, I really love this quote, and I want to use it on the wall, but I really don't like exactly one of these words. So he says, "Keep moving. Let nothing slow you up. Move on with dignity, love, and respectability." And I was like, I just really don't like that last word. And I thought for just a hot second, I could just do that ... thing. I entertained that for a second. I was like, we could just not put that respectability word because it's so bad. And then I quickly was like, no, that's a bad idea. I do not dare actually try to edit Dr. King's words. I'm nowhere near an amazing activist and orator as he is or was. And also we know that happened in DC where somebody tried to do that, and they changed the quotation, and it was a huge uproar, and Maya Angelou was one of the people who really went hard after them for what they did. And then they ended up having to redo this whole thing, and it was really expensive and stuff like that. So I did not do it, but I thought it was important to make a point about that, though, because I was like, instead of trying to just erase the stuff, or maybe I could just act like I don't notice, or I could just not include it. But it's actually important to talk about it because it's a strategy. It's a strategy that they were using. They were using that respectability thing. They were really doing it, and they were trying it. And it's a strategy that's still going on now that some people are using, and there's reasons. And that's why I kind of named the talk By Any Means Necessary, as much as I'm not really talking about Malcolm X for real in this talk. So I appropriated that, but I'm using it kind of loosely because I'm thinking about the various strategies for activism and visual, and using the visual that people have done really for kind of a same aim. But sometimes some of this stuff is problematic in what they do. I want to go back just briefly to that one that I said interests me a great deal because like I said, he's embedded, and now he's become one of the people. They have their hands raised, I think like in agreement with the speaker, whoever it is, if it's Dr. King or many of the other people who were up there that day talking. They have their hands raised, and now I think when you think about the viewer becomes one of the folks in the quote crowd. People often call these people the crowd. I don't think of them as a crowd. I think of them as activists. All of these people who are there that day and these people on the ground, they are freedom fighters. And so this picture, what I like is it puts the viewer in that position of being one of the freedom fighters that day. And I don't think that this picture and some of the other ones, but especially this picture, could be handled really through the white visual culture media that was at that time. Freelander couldn't find anybody to publish these pictures. And there were, like I said, there were other photographers there, and there were pictures that were published. There was a huge spread in Ebony magazine. It's interesting to do a contrast, but not doing that today, about the types of pictures that they have and which got published. And then, years later, so many people don't know about it and don't know about this march, and there's sometimes, if I've seen these photos, not these particular ones, but photos of this march on view in museums, and they have it with the 1963 date. They think it's the other march. That's how much people don't know about it. I think at the time, when he was trying to pitch it to a bunch of people to take the photographs to publish, I don't think people thought this was going to be that important. It just, Yeah, it's a thing that happened. Some pictures got published. We don't need tons of pictures of that. It's not going to be, they really had no idea how this was going to just keep rolling and what was going to happen. This is in May 1957. We know in September, we know about what happened in Arkansas, right, with the at Central High School with the kids. And of course, the movement ramps up and it just goes more and more so. So the little boy, love him. And then thinking about the Black Panthers. So Black Power movement and thinking about this next generation of youth. And again, let's just, in your mind, try to think back to those pictures of Du Bois, 1900, of the kind of respectable, black folks, those kind of images. Just try to keep those in your mind. And thinking about these pictures of the Black Panthers, one of the things I've heard people say what I've read, and it's real fun to meet people who were kids at this time and hear them say that when they start seeing these kind of images coming out showing the Black Panthers in California, they were like, I want to be part of that. That was, especially young people. The Black Panthers, when you start really researching, you find it was actually a lot of women, and it was a lot of women and very young people, like under 19, like 19 and under, who were part of the Black Panther movement. Often we see images of, certain guys, and they got their guns and stuff, and we see these men, and yes, they were, of course, in the movement and important players, but it was a lot of really young people. So I think of it as a really interesting, exciting time. I haven't done a lot of research yet on these images of the Black Panther movement. I'm just starting to touch on it a little bit. I'm working on a show that will be in New Haven next year, and we're going to think about a trial that happened with Bobby Seale in New Haven. So I'll have more opportunity to be thinking about this over the next several months. Here's some more photographs by Stephen Shame. So he's a white photographer that was taking pictures, photojournalist, very strong interest in racial justice and social justice work. It's important to think about who's taking the pictures and their connection, again, to these causes. Because a lot of times with civil rights pictures, they're being taken by white photojournalists that aren't not really part of they're not part of the movement. They're people that were coming there. Some of them were sympathetic, some of them weren't. But they had a job, and they were coming, and they were taking pictures. The people who really are committed often spent a lot of time and got to know people in deeper ways. And it's interesting to think about the difference in the type of images. And this one I think is in New Haven, because we're using it in the show that I'm going to be doing. So I'm not going to talk about that a lot, but just, again, thinking about the viewers for these and young people seeing what was happening and being like, I want to be part of that versus that. Be respectable, walk this way, do this, do that, try to fall in line. There were a lot of young people who were just like, especially after the Emmett Till thing, there was a feeling that something else needed to happen. There needed to be stronger kind of change. There needed to be people more just unapologetic about their blackness. This is Emory Douglas. Excuse me, Emory Douglas. He was there, I think, called the Minister of Culture, is the title that he had. He did the graphic design work for the Black Panthers. He gave a talk that I heard a few years ago, and he kept using the word remix over and over in his talk. But basically, he's kind of appropriating different materials and like doing photo collage and things like that. And really interesting work. I'm not going to talk about it in detail. But again, I just wanted to highlight the audience is different for who's reading the Black Panther newspaper and thinking about the type of imagery that they produce. And it's a sense, again, of empowerment it's trying to encourage Black empowerment. And it's very different than what you would see like in the crisis. Of course, it's a very different time, but it's also a very different audience. And not going with that respectability thing. We've just totally abandoned that. It's a very different kind of imagery that they're putting out. Now I'm going to switch up a whole lot. Again, Decolonize This Place. Have some of you heard of this initiative? Yeah, okay. Wow, this is a good audience. Yay. Sometimes people are like, I don't know what you're talking about. And in here, I'm only talking about this was a little earlier when they were highlighting issues of the Brooklyn Museum. There was an uproar about the Brooklyn Museum hiring this for their curator of African art, they hired a white woman to be the curator, and there was quite an uproar that was happening online in these social media spaces, and then outside of that too. But I was following some of this stuff online, and it was really interesting to see, as someone who's spent a lot of time working in museums, that it doesn't actually surprise me that, I mean, if you know about it more, often the curator for African art is a white person in most museums. That it's just who is partly of the museums. Museums are generally very white spaces, first of all, but also, and especially with African art, who is making the studies in that area, it's often white scholars. So in many ways for me, I was like, yeah, well, it didn't surprise me. It's not to say that is all of these things are fine, but it's also just a symptom of museums. Interestingly, in the whole colonialism and all that, you know, all of this stuff is a package deal. So with museums of how they get the collections and all of these ties, and so who ends up being scholars in these areas is tied to all of those histories. So the Decolonize This Place is an activist organization in New York, and it's a lot of artists and other people, but a lot of artists. And they have been pushing for a lot of radical work for years. And some people only know about the recent thing that they were focusing on, the Whitney Biennial. So this was right before Whitney Biennial. They had their lens focused on Brooklyn Museum, and we're putting a lot of energy there. But then that kind of changed up, and they've been focused on particularly a board member, Warren Kanders, who they learned, who basically is the owner of Safari Land that produces tear gas and everything that was used at the border on migrants. And also other things with Kanders' business practices that people question. So there was a lot going on there. A lot of people know about Decolonize This Place because of that a series of actions that they did for months, campaigning against the administration at the museum, and along with other people, and ended up that Kanders has finally stepped down. That's very recent, like in the last 2 weeks or something. This thing, the Brooklyn Museum, is interesting because they wrote an open letter and they highlighted a whole bunch of things that they wanted to see changed in the institution. And it's really, I think it didn't get the credit that it should get because it's quite involved. And I think people were just doing a straw man argument and just going, oh, they just want this and they don't understand. They don't understand a museum. And they would pick out like one part, but they wouldn't, there's like 7 things at least that they listed. And they're really in depth. And as far as what I saw, the only responses from I think there was something that the museum director had wrote a response, but it was only to like one aspect and didn't really engage with it deeply. And then there were a couple of art historians that wrote something, and again, only focusing on one aspect and not thinking about it deeply. Again, thinking about what representation means in museums, right? So who gets to be in these spaces? I think sometimes many of us get happy with just a little bit, like a couple of crumbs thrown our way. If we are able to do an exhibition in a space, if maybe the institution starts changing their collection practices a little bit and they acquire certain things. Some people get real happy and go, wow, it's great. Look, everything has changed. It's not. Those are small gestures, really, that are things that are long overdue, and so many other things need to happen. And so, again, thinking about the difference between representation and actual structural change, what Decolonize This Place has been pushing for is actual deep structural change. And many people are fearful of what these kind of changes would mean to an institution. They're like, well, that can't happen, because if we were to do all of these things, like some of them on here, you can see they say stuff like upgrading the working conditions for staff, replacing the board president, degentrification. I mean, they want some hard stuff. They want deep diversification of all the curatorial staff and leadership positions. They want to focus on BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. A a lot of like deep work thinking about Palestine and Israel kind of relationships. That's all the stuff that the responses from leadership, they did not engage those things. They just picked like the easiest thing and just tried to do this straw man argument. If institutions were to actually address all of these things, that would be amazing, right? And that would be really kind of the undoing of what we have. And that's why a lot of places, a lot of institutions, most aren't going to want to do that. They're not going to sign up to do it. And so for the most part, you're going to get very limited kind of response. First, I would just say belittling is a strategy. And then maybe to offer some kind of diversity initiative kind of thing. Maybe to acquire a few objects, those kind of things. There are certain measures. And I find it really interesting because I work in museums, but I study museums. It's like part of what I'm doing is studying how they operate and what their responses are. I probably talk way too long. I did want to jump to this. Have people seen this work? I don't know if you've seen it in in New York, but this artist is, and I didn't put her name on here, I'm sorry about that. Her name is Alexandra Bell, and you can follow her on Instagram. Her name on Instagram is Yes, It's Alex. I've been following her for a long time. She started with these, this is a street art project she started, and so, with the murder of Mike Brown, she was looking at how the New York Times, how they framed the whole discussion. And I should say Alexandra Bell's background is in journalism, but she's also an artist, so she started out as a journalist. And she's looking at a lot of the factual problems of how journalism or how the New York Times, but other publications too, mainly New York Times, how they present things. And so she did a reproduction of the page that they put out, basically the kind of 2 lives or something at the crossroads or something. That puts, it basically takes away the horror of what the police officer did to Mike Brown and tries to put, again, that whole leveling thing, doing this both sides, kind of strange and highly prevalent kind of thing in the news. So she basically is dismantling that. She's using this redaction method, and then she comes up with her own, what she feels that the headline image should have looked like and how it should be framed, what the headline should say. And then these were on view in the Bedford-Stuyvesant area in Brooklyn. So these were pasted up in a bunch of places like wheat paste, and sometimes people would pull them down, but a lot of them lasted for a long time. And I actually got to see one, I think, last year. So this was years ago, but these are still, there's some of them still up, and I got to see one, and I was just elated. She's put these up in subways and other things. And again, it's to think again about who the audience is and what representation means. Alexandra is not actually, her focus wasn't on so much to appeal to the New York Times, per se, to get them to change their strategies. I mean, that's a nice thing if they do, but we know they've been doing a whole bunch of stupid stuff for a long time and continue to do so. That's just me, to say that. They were actually one of the last people to talk to her. I think the New Yorker did a review with her, and she's gotten press and stuff for this quite a bit, and now her work is on view in museums and things like that. She also has a series where she's focusing on how the Central Park 5, how that was covered when that happened, and then she redoes things, and she has all this redaction kind of stuff. So now her work is on view in museums. She's still doing street artwork as well, but this is a focus more on another person I wanted to highlight briefly is Lee Rayford. It's Professor Lee Rayford from UC Berkeley. She has this book called Imprisoned in a Luminous Glare, and she looks at the different strategies that people have used with photography for racial justice work. And when I read her book, it's just one of those phenomenal books. I haven't even finished the whole thing for real because I was focused on certain areas. In her book, she introduces this concept where she talks about critical black memory. And she's not the first person to put that idea out there, but she talks about it, elaborates on it a great deal, and it's really important to think about. She says how basically black communities, how they adopt these pictures and they use these photographs, they're basically it's a form of activism. Like remembering is activism. It's not just that we are having some historical record and like it's away from us. It's actually an ongoing kind of living thing. She says it basically collapses what people conceive as some kind of difference between memory and history. That memory and history, they're not these totally distinct, separate things. That Black people are using these pictures as a way of building community with one another. They're using it as a way to activate change. And I think in many ways, she's talking about like civil rights movement and thinking about their uses. And it's really a wonderful book. You just have to read it. I can't talk about all those things she says in there, but it's really important. But they're really thinking through how they're using the photography. And I think it's like she talks about like the Emmett Till images. That's a form of that kind of critical Black memory. The fact that those pictures continue to resonate with people like 60 years later, and people see it as something where they're responding now, thinking about those Emmett Till pictures, it's something really important activist work that's happening there. And thinking with what Alexandra Bell is doing here too is kind of, tying to like the Black Lives Matter movement of that is a rallying cry saying Black Lives Matter, as we're speaking to one another that we matter. We are creating a community of care. And what Alexandra has done in this work to me is that as part of that community of care, that she's saying, hey, we get this. This was a person. He had a life. He was important. She's creating a moment of care for Mike Brown's family, for other Black people, for those of us who care. So I'm going to wrap up here, and I want to say something. So my goal tonight has been not to really kind of put down Du Bois's project or anything like that, but I've been trying to show how this is a very layered kind of thing. And there are many textures of working with visual culture for racial justice work. And it's so important to think to be critical about these things and to think about what the work is actually doing and how people engage with it and not let things get co-opted or not to let people stop with this one thing that they present. I wanted to think about the role of visual culture in terms of organizing it, collecting it, how displaying it is a very complicated thing, to think about questions like, can photography actually motivate change? Can museums be a site for radical work? It's a really good question. Because, as I've been trying to stress, representation alone does not equal structural change, and usually that's often at best what we hear from museums in particular. And representation alone is not racial justice. So I think that when what we're doing in the arts in our institutions, when we align ourselves with communities and we work for and with them, and this work is, and I mean with them, if we work with the communities that are most harmed, we can actually start really doing some important things. This would involve a commitment to unmaking current structures. It must be an unmaking to be world-making. This isn't all brand new stuff or anything, actually. People have been doing this. Those of us who care about one another, we create our own spaces all the time of care, of remembering, of honoring, of feeling, of community. And Toni Morrison taught me that. So as you recall, I opened with a passage from Toni Morrison, and I basically want to end with a passage. Let me see. This is from her book, Beloved. I want to end with this passage from Beloved, and I want to ask you to think about this in terms of these reflections on the relationship of representation and racial justice. So this is from Beloved. You are my sister. You are my daughter. You are my face. You are me. I have found you again. You have come back to me. You are my beloved. You are mine. You are mine. You are mine. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. I'd be happy to talk with you. I want to hear what you all are working on, and if you have questions you want to share, I'd love to hear.
And we have microphones that we'd love to pass so that everyone can hear the questions. And we have one on this side and that side. Just raise your hand.
Can you hear me okay if I'm seated? Yeah. Okay. I would love to know if for the Paris exhibit in 1900, if there was any pushback to not even have W.E.B. Du Bois pieces shown. I realize that he wasn't the photographer of them, but to have his collection shown.
So I'm not exactly sure. They were on view at the Paris exposition in 1900. The series of the pictures that he was collecting in the archive that he created, it was on view. There were 3 volumes. There was that display space that I showed you. It's really interesting. 19th century there. Methods.
I just didn't know if for those who were behind having whatever was on view at the exhibit, if there was ever any pushback to not have had those images in the first place.
Oh, yeah, I don't know about that. I would doubt
Thank
it.
you.
I would doubt it, but from just knowing about that time, but I don't know. That is a good question, but I haven't studied that well, but if somebody else knows, definitely, please share. Thank you. Somebody over here. Oh, in the back.
Thank you for your lecture. I was curious too, like you were mentioning the connections with Toni Morrison, and she had written a play called Remembering Emmett, and she had talked about her kind of experience with the photographs, and was just curious if you knew much more about that and had made any of those connections.
I haven't done that. Yeah, I don't know about that play. Thank you for telling me about it. Now I'm going to go look for that probably tonight when I should be sleeping or something. But I definitely want to look at that, and I think it's really interesting. I've read a few people's account of seeing those pictures when they were young. And, I really think it's so important to think about, like, her age of her growing up. Like, she was born in the 30s, and so how old she would have been, like, in her 20s when Till were around that time, a young person. And so Toni Morrison, I always find her so amazing how she talks about stuff where she's so, like she said this thing about working in a Random House where she was in pretty much a white male industry, and she said it wasn't interesting. She wasn't intimidated by them. She didn't find them interesting, that she knew she was more interesting in them. Like, she is very confident, about herself, and I admire that a great deal. I feel like more of us should be like that. But I think about the difference of what she was growing up, her period as opposed to someone like people growing up in the 1900s and in the heyday of lynching, and thinking of the difference. It's going to be a very different context. Of course, she's also just a really unique individual. So some of how she responds is just probably Toni Morrison. It's not just the times. But thank you for telling me about this. It's called Remembering Emmett something.
I'm going to pass the mic
I'm
down
gonna look for
here.
that.
In all artistic forms, what that role would be today in trying to help us get through this period.
So what is the role of the contemporary artist today in helping us get through this period is the question?
Yes.
Some artists, I think sometimes people conflate things and think that all of the arts is about freedom and free expression and things like that. I would say some artists are committed to racial justice, some artists are committed to social justice. That's really foundational in their practice, and they really do that work. But I would say a lot of people do not. They're making art, and some people, I'm not saying I agree with this, but they feel that their art is not political. I think all art is, but anyway, that's another talk. We could be out here all weekend. But yeah, a lot of artists, they're not committed to actually big structural change and things like that. And sometimes it's very depressing or disappointing, because I might actually really like their work, and then I learn more about them and I read what they say, or I get to meet them, and they sometimes really belittle projects where people are fighting for social change and trying to really push for progressive action. And sometimes it's really disheartening, but that's their perspective. And they still might be making work that visually is engaging, and it might actually be helping some of those goals that I have and some other folks. Like it might be helping those movements, even though that's not what their own personal perspective is. So I don't know. I can't really say. I think it's going to be up to the individual. Of course. Oh, I think the arts, yeah. Oh, sorry. I think the arts are pivotal. I think they are always been part of great social change. I don't think it's something that's over on the side. I think often it's put like that by some people that try to present the arts as not that important. Recently I was reading, I wish I could find it. I hope I printed it because I can't remember things after if I don't print them out. But I was reading this article where this person was talking about the lack of attention to artists who are undocumented on these kind of issues about migration. And so this person was critiquing, so that public artist JR, who did this, he does this mural in Mexico that's like a kid that's like looking over the border fence, right? That's a huge thing. So that's gotten a lot of attention. And so I was reading, and I don't remember the name of the artist, but the artist who wrote it is someone who's undocumented and was talking about he's an artist. And it's interesting that there's so many artists who are also undocumented, but they're not getting that kind of media attention. They're not getting that hype, right? That other people who really don't have stakes in the game, like that guy JR, he has no stake in that. You know, while that might be a cool piece in itself, he is not an undocumented folk. He's a white cisgender, I think I'm not sure, but I think he's a white cisgender dude. And he doesn't have the same proximity to violence that these other people have. And they are out there doing really important organizing and work. They're making their stuff and they're showing up at things, even though they are being surveilled, and basically their lives can be taken in any second, so much more so than this person. But in terms of who's getting media attention, often it's the people who are in positions of power. And he was saying that it's also it's a great article. I'm talking all about it now. I don't even remember the person who wrote it. But what I like that he said is also the movements themselves. So while there is this really important movement happening, and I don't remember if he highlighted any specific organizations, but fighting the racism and xenophobia, that they're not actually looking at artists who are talking about these things and who are often undocumented. They should be working with those folks, LGBTQ folks and stuff who are at risk and who are doing that work. They're not even understanding that those are important people that they should be involving in all the organizing and not just coming to people later and being like, hey, can you make a poster? But they should be involved from the get-go in all of these things. Thought it was a really important piece. And I think it's important to highlight that kind of criticism of our movements, that we often aren't working together as well as we could be. Thank you for that question.
Hi. I just saw that you were going to be speaking here tonight, and I was really excited, and I rushed down here because I'm working on something that deals with issues of race and art and the understanding of art and the presentation of art. And you asked what we're all doing, so I thought, well, I'll share with you what I'm doing. My name's Juliana Zhao, and I'm working on Students of Color Curate is an initiative that I started. And the idea is to present also the interpretations of students of color of art on college campuses. One of the things the event that started me on this project was that I work at Portland Community College and I teach art history there. And there was a work of art at one of our campuses that was contested by a member of the community, I believe who's now a city commissioner, and she as offensive, and then it was taken down. And I'm not out to voice any specific opinion, but it was all done in a very hushed way, and even as faculty, I wasn't able to get very much information about it. And I'm really interested in continuing conversations and learning from what's happening, and in the way that our choices in how we handle situations like these really reveal our positions on issues. And so Students of Color Curate is having an exhibition that opens October 3rd at the Northview Gallery on Sylvania campus at PCC. And I'm also organizing a symposium to have this conversation in October. So
That's
I just
great.
wanted to mention that, and thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. Yeah, that kind of hush job, that something like that happened in New Haven. Art Space is an organization I've been working with there. They had an artist who made this work that I guess you could say it was a critique of the police. So it was like a pig, like it's a kind of cartoon-like image of a pig with a cop hat on. So anyway, he made this mural, and it was placed outside. They were having open studios, and his thing was put on the outside of the building, and it's kind of small. It's just almost like cartoon-like and humorous. So, and it didn't say it was necessarily the police, but it's in that vein of like the Emory Douglas that I just touched on a little bit. And someone complained, and it was always really vague about who really complained, but it was near an area, there's a quote, correctional facility, prison, in this area, and someone went to the city, and it became this big thing, and then it ended up that Art Space took it down. I think they were told that he could have it on view inside, but not on the outside of the building. And Art Space took it down, but then later felt like maybe we shouldn't have just given up that like so quickly, because they were afraid of losing funding, I think, from the city. And that's just me saying that, not as officially Art Space, but I think they were concerned about what it would mean as a small arts organization for them to try to push. But then they felt they did a discussion with people in the community, and I went to that talk. I went to a couple talks on this, and it was really interesting to hear people say, and they were like, maybe you should have tried though. Like you should have held on to that. No, this is art, and we're going to keep it out here and just see where it would go. And it was again the feeling of we don't know what the practices are or what the process is for stuff like that if it's public art and someone complains, and who is this person? And it was never really sure. Nobody ever got to know who the person was. They just went, so apparently somebody went to the city, but nobody's even sure if that even really happened, if it was just somebody at the city's office who didn't want it to happen. So unfortunately, it's like kind of a common thing, I think, these things that happen, and many of us are frightened because we're living on the edge and we don't get much funding, or it's artists that are, people of color who are at jeopardy, don't want to have issues with the cops and stuff like that, and with the city coming after them. And often people fold really quickly, and we all are kind of living where it's really kind of horrible when you think about it. It's quite oppressive if we don't know what our rights are, we don't know what policies are in place, but we're all really fearful. It's actually a horrible thing to think about it from a big picture kind of way. The artist, he refused to kind of compromise on the location that was pivotal to him about where it was located, and so he said he chose to just take it down completely.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Pariah. I'm with Don't Shoot Portland, one of the presenting organizations today. If you have not already been formally invited, I would like to invite you to come tomorrow at the DCBC, the Dismantle Change Build Center at 14 Northeast Killingsworth Street, tomorrow afternoon for the 5th anniversary of Mike Brown's murder by Officer Darren Wilson. And my question is, will you please say more about respectability and what's wrong with it, and how it looks in 2019, please?
Yeah, the whole respectability thing is so messed up that it's such a dominant, approach still, or some people still want to argue for it. It's the idea, if you behave a certain way, I could have put those prayer pilgrimage pictures up in many ways. If you dressed a certain way, if you, like how those people, they're really trying to adhere to kind of a white middle class, an idea of what a white middle class aesthetic is or something. If you emulate these people, they won't kill you. I mean, to put it in a very simple kind of way. If you talk a certain way, if you get a certain kind of education, if you behave a certain way and you seem very respectable, you will not be labeled a threat. And that is actually ridiculous. It's a lot of stuff about that is is messed up. It's very anti-black in a lot of ways. basically to say it's got a lot of classism kind of issues going on, so that like whatever working class folks, people who aren't college educators, and they don't talk a certain way, that, well, you weren't behaving the right way, you don't dress the right way, that's why you got pulled over, that's why you got stopped at the store while you were being racially profiled, why you get to die. It's outrageous, because I sometimes hear it from black people who will use it as an excuse for why that's why that person, they drew attention to themselves because they weren't following in line with this respectability policy. And it seems like outrageous because that was a dominant, you think about Du Bois, okay, the time he was living in, I kind of get it, right? But we know it doesn't work because we've seen it, people doing that for decades, and it never worked. And people were being lynched during Du Bois' time. We saw, of course, all those decades, and then the 50s and stuff like that. And there was a moment where people just rejected that, like the fact that, I'm not walking around, I don't have my hair pressed. Somebody could say, well, see, you were looking kind of whatever, that's why you're drawing attention to yourself. So if you get stopped, if I have certain problems, I'm the one who's creating the problem. And I think what it is sad because it's kind of a sense of denial or something that we're going through. It's kind of part of that American pathology that we've got going on. We don't want to actually address the real problems, and we don't want to see that if you're just black, you're at jeopardy. Like all of us. I'm always a threat. That's basically what I say. I was in Panera. I was telling a few people this earlier today. I was in, I don't know if I told everybody. I told Mike this. I was in Panera, and I was told some other people. Anyway, doesn't matter. I told some people. So I was in Panera at lunchtime, and I was just trying to sit down, and this woman that was sitting next to me, she was with three women, these three white women, and this one woman grabbed her purse instantly, and I thought, oh, that's kind of weird. Okay, I wasn't going to step on your purse, but I thought it was just about that she thought I was going to step on it. But then she clutched it to her chest, and I was like, what the hell? Okay. And then she just kept doing it and staring at me, and I was like, you really think I'm going to rob you? Like, what am I doing? It is so threatening. I'm just got a tray, and I'm trying to sit down. And then I was like, oh, I'm brown. My skin is brown. I'm black. And I am a threat. It doesn't matter anything about who I am. I know that. And many of us know that, not everybody, but many of us know that who are black, that any moment you could have, your life is at jeopardy. You could be singled out as a problem. And I didn't do anything. She grabbed her bag 3 times while I was at Panera. And I kept stopping, thinking how this was so disruptive to my lunch, and should I say something? What am I going to say to this idiot? And then I just ended up being like, I don't even want to spend time on her right now. I'm going to move on. But I thought about it like for days. I'm still talking about it. It happened like months ago. And that's just a little thing. A whole bunch of stuff happens. But that's just like a little thing. But respectability politics is unfortunate because so many people still push it and think it is some kind of mode of how we can be better, or we can have our life. we can live if we just behaved a certain way. I don't know if that's what you wanted, if you were hoping for some more, but that's kind of what I got right now. There's like a few people with hands up over here.
Thank you very much for the lecture and for spanning the decades the way that you did, well, more than the decades. My question is, I'm curious.
Can you wave? I don't know where you are. Oh, hey.
So, I'm curious to know, given the many issues and themes that have been brought up, from your perspective, what would it look like in terms of the feedback that you would like to see that visitors coming to see this exhibit would express to the museum? What would that look like?
That's a really good one. That's for everybody here, especially the people who work here at Portland Art Museum and other folks. I guess I would want to think about I guess I would just ask questions about, like, how do those pictures relate to today, right? How we think about who has power. Just the Bois is putting that collection together. I would think about the institution I would like, if I was a visitor, I've just seen the exhibition briefly today, so it's the first time, but I would think about who has the right to put shows together here in this space. And I would really be questioning that whole middle class thing a lot. I think they're important pictures, but I think we should also really be focusing on the class issues in those photographs. I think we should be focused on the gender issues and think about the relationship of, like institutionally, what does that mean when we put those on view? Are we promoting, like, because there's a lot of problematic stuff in those things. Are we questioning it enough in the display that we have on view? Or are we celebrating too much of, like, I think it's often collapses, what it was doing really important work, right? In terms of showing Black people as people, right? That is essentially a really big part of it, but it also is tied into these other areas that are problematic. Are we pushing? Are we going to ask, and how is the institution pushing at it? I mentioned briefly that quote from Dr. King's speech, and my reticence and even the short idea that I entertained of changing that when I would, or just don't put it in a show. I ended up putting it on the wall in my show, and I worried about it a little bit because when I was in the space, I gave a lot of tours of that show, like probably over 30 tours at the time that it was up, and I always highlighted that in my of it being a conflict for me, but I also talked about a lot of how the people were dressed and think about respectability policy. I made it a point every time I did a tour, and I talked about it in the essay that I wrote. So it was in there, but it wasn't like slapped all over the walls real big to make a big point that I'm critiquing that, while I also think that speech is really important. I think what these people did is really important, but I'm also critiquing it, and I'm thinking in relationship to right now. I added that to my particular tours. Other people gave tours of that show too, and I've only went on some of them. And they were, of course, they're all different. And often other people didn't highlight that as an issue at all. And if people didn't read the essay, which most people probably didn't, they don't get that. And that bothered me actually a lot. And I thought about it like, well, okay, I put that up there so that it look like, and when you do it, when you work there as a curator, you put it up on the wall, people see it as this is what the institution is promoting. And so if you only see the quote, it looks like I'm promoting respectability politics, right? Because I put up there respectability. But I put it, as I told you, for a reason, and tried to have my little asterisks, the things that I'm doing to try to intervene. But those things happen in a certain temporal dimension, right? They're not happening, and they're in the essay, but you just know that most people aren't reading those essays. And so it left a lot up to others, and I think sometimes that's just going to be how it is. That's really probably most of life, is just stuff is up to other people. You put things out, and you try to do it, you try to network with a lot of people and make a stand, but is everybody going to engage with it that way? Are the other people who are going to take on the project, when they go do their tour, are they going to do it the same way? Most of the time, no. But I would ask questions like that, like what is the museum doing to intervene with that kind of respectability focus? For me, that would be really important to ask.
Maybe we'll take one more.
I have a hand back here.
Oh,
Is there one up there?
yeah.
Oh, my bad.
Oh, sure, thank you. Thanks for being here and for your wonderful presentation. It is a big shift between 1900, the exhibit, and then W.E.B. Du Bois' piece in the crisis. Mm-hmm. His lifelong conflict with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington seeming to be the father of respectability. The 1900 exhibits seeming to be very Booker T. Washington-ish. Is there a clear shift that W.E.B. Du Bois writes about, talks about, that is reflected in the different use of art, of respectability versus social justice and confrontation?
That's a great observations there, good question. I haven't done probably enough work in this area, but what I will say is, and I'm reading this book right now, The Souls of Black Folks, Du Bois has got a lot of respectability stuff going on too. As much as he's a critic of Booker T. Washington, he is a definite strong proponent of respectability politics. He's just doing it in a certain way that's different, a little different. But he brings up that whole respectability thing in there. He brings up the whole idea of the talented 10th in there, which is, of course, definitely respectability politics. So he also, there is, over his whole life, like he dies in 1963, he dies in Ghana, and he changed a lot. Like his politics changed radically, actually I would say probably at the end of his life, and I can't talk very in-depth or cogently about that, but the little bit I know that he didn't end up promoting the same ideas that he had very early, which makes sense, of course. He only had just graduated in 1895, and then a few years later was putting that show together. So early thoughts from his training, and then over time and doing all the activist work. And early on too, in his work, he wrote an essay, I think called, what's it called, The Negro something? Can't remember the name of it exactly. Probably have it. It's in Sean Michelle Smith's book, so definitely look at that book, Photography on the Color Line. But he wrote this essay, I think it's called On Negro Art. I think that's the name of it. It's an early essay. And he talks a lot about art as propaganda. And he believed in that very much. So the art, to him, the art that was important was it had a political meaning, and he thought about it as propaganda. And that's, again, in more the early part of his career. And I don't know like what he starts thinking about later, but I think he changed in radical ways later on in the 60s, and he ended up migrating to Ghana, where he died in 63. But I think some of the stuff he thought he could achieve through using respectability politics and other things, he realized that didn't work. And I think there was and I don't know what year that was, but I know he ended up kind of abandoning a lot of the stuff that he was trying to do before. And he just learned it wasn't gonna happen, or happen that way. And so a good book also I read, which I should go back and reread that section on W.E.B. Du Bois. A good book is called Stamped from the Beginning. Oh, yes. Yeah, so some of you know it and have read this. And I was talking about that earlier today. A very huge book, over 500 pages. It's by Dr. Ibram Kendi. He's a professor of history at American University. He has a new book coming out this month called How to Be an Anti-Racist. Anyway, within Stamped from the Beginning, he is looking at the history. It's called Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And he looks at just this, the system of racism, how it's set up and the work that it's doing. It's doing some really important stuff, and it's very networked. And one of the chapters, or it's not really chapters, he has huge sections, and he looks at the history through the lens of different people. So there's like a chapter on section on Thomas Jefferson, on William Garrison, W.E.B. Du Bois, I think Frederick Douglass, Angela Davis. It's really wonderful because it's not that kind of dry history reading, too, that can be hard, especially if it's over 500 pages. It's really like a story, the writing style, but you are getting all that history. And so anyway, there's a whole section on Du Bois, and I meant to actually reread that. I read it last year, and I didn't have time to reread it for this talk today. But yeah, I think he was always into respectability politics. It's just a different version than Booker T. Washington, but they probably have more in common than they are typically positioned as. Thank you.
Thank you.